I'm Jesse Morin with Gilware Data Recovery. In recent years, we've seen some great advances in solid-state technology, leading to better, more affordable solid-state drives. A lot of consumers have been taking advantage of this by putting solid states in their computers. However, they don't really know much about them. So today we're going to take apart this Intel 320 series SSD and take a look at just what's inside. So here we have a closer look at our drive. You can see the name and the size, 160 gigabytes. We're going to go ahead and take this drive apart through the miracle of a bad jump cut. There we go, we're good to go. Now you can see the inside of the drive, the NAND flash chips here, the processor or controller right here, and the SATA over here. Those are the big three that you're going to find in pretty much every solid state. There's a few other components we can talk about that are not necessarily present in some solid state drives, but we can talk about them anyway because they're interesting. So NAND flash memory is the first component we'll discuss, and it's the storage for our drive, also known as non-volatile memory, since it doesn't need a power source to keep the data. This can be compared to the spinning platters or disks of a hard drive, but instead of storing the information on a magnetic substrate, it's stored in the stationary NAND flash memory chips. The lack of any moving parts is actually why we call them solid-state drives. They're in a solid state. There's no need for spinning disks or rapidly moving read-write heads. The reason this memory in particular is called NAND flash memory is because the memory uses not-AND logic gates, or NAND for short. Now the way NAND flash memory stores data is through the use of floating gate transistors. Floating gates are electrically isolated, meaning they have no electrical contacts because they're insulated by oxide layers. Because of this, electrons are able to stay within the floating gates for years. There are multiple ways we can get electrons into the floating gates, but the basis is by utilizing quantum tunneling to get them through the oxide layer from the channel. Because those electrons aren't leaving the floating gate anytime soon, we use the presence or absence of those electrons to represent the zeros and ones of our data. This is called SLC, or single-level cell NAND, since there's only two possible charge states. We can also use different amounts of electrons to represent different charges, and thus increase our data storage density. This is how MLC, or multi-level cell NAND, works. All consumer-grade drives use MLC NAND, including this one. Of course, the full explanation on solid-state storage is much longer than that, but that's the basics of it. Next up we have our processor, also known as the controller. This little guy is the fastest and debatably most important part of the drive since it's responsible for interfacing between the other components and is essentially the brains for the drive. When I say it's the fastest part of the drive, I mean it executes operations on the order of nanoseconds, a nanosecond being 1/1000th of a second. It performs operations that are written into the firmware, such as all the reading, writing, erasing, encryption, garbage collection, wear leveling, and over-provisioning. Wow. I apologize if you don't know what some of those operations are, but just know they're important. Without the controller to perform all these functions, your solid-state drive would pretty much just be an elaborate hunk of scrap metal. So yeah, it's pretty important. Third, we'll look at the SATA interface, which is this part here on the end with the gold pin connectors. This is the part that connects up with the computer and is connected through SATA power and data cables. Power is the big one, data is the small one. There's not much to explain about the SATA interface, other than it's the bridge that allows the transfer of data between your SSD and your computer, as well as brings power to the SSD. Finally, we've gotten to the components that aren't in some solid-state drives, but can certainly be useful for the ones that do have them. That's not to say that all SSDs even need these components, since some of them work slightly differently. But anyway, these components are the SDRAM and capacitors. The SDRAM, or Synchronous Dynamic Random Access Memory, is the volatile memory for your SSD. I mentioned earlier that NAND flash memory is non-volatile, meaning it doesn't need a power source to store data. Well, you've probably figured out that because it's volatile memory, SDRAM does require a power source to store data. If there's no power going to your SSD, like when your computer is turned off, the SDRAM flushes the data out and forgets everything. So what's the point of having it if it's seemingly less functional than NAND? Well, it isn't less functional than NAND. It's actually faster and allows the controller to run programs quickly. The SDRAM only serves as working memory for your controller, and it only puts data here that's essential for whatever the task at hand requires. You can imagine that volatile memory requiring power to store data can cause some problems, and you're right. If there's a sudden loss of power, whatever is stored in the RAM can be lost forever, which is similar to the reason you're not supposed to just pull a USB out of your computer before ejecting it. This can corrupt files and cause data loss if the drive had data in the RAM when you cut the power. This problem leads me to the final components, which are the capacitors. In the event of a sudden loss of power, these capacitors serve as an emergency power source to flush any data in the RAM back into the NAND flash memory so you don't lose it forever. They're a cool failsafe to prevent data loss. Of course, one component I didn't mention is the PCB, or printed circuit board, and that's this green thing underneath all the other pieces. This is the component that allows all the other parts to work together and communicate with each other, so your drive works exactly how it's supposed to. That concludes our video on what's inside a solid-state drive. Here at Gilware, we want to thank you for watching and we hope you enjoyed it.